At one point during its existence, the cantonment held 1,300 troops, about half the American military at the time.
These are both French and British gunflints.
For generations, plows cut deep into the soil of this overgrown Pulaski County farm field. Now the field produces a different harvest, a harvest of knowledge. Beneath the weeds is the story of the American soldier and life on the frontier 2 centuries ago.
And we had this disked up last year.
Archaeologist Mark Wagner began the investigation the summer before.
You can see that there are certain areas where the brick frequency jumps up extremely high. And
That's when he found clusters of broken brick throughout the field, a good sign buildings once stood here.
And what we're trying to do is systematically move across this entire area here. And if we can do that, we should be able to start picking up the locations of these individual structures.
There's no doubt this is where the camp was located. Now the question is whether artifacts and features can be found below the top layer of soil known as the plow zone. If Wagner can find those deeper features, it will elevate the importance of the site. In a few hours, he'll know the answer. At one point during its existence, the cantonment held 1,300 troops, about half the American military at the time. The soldiers lived in log cabins with fireplaces and chimneys built of brick made on the site. Among the soldiers were at least 6 future members of the Lewis and Clark expedition. The cantonment stood on this hill for only 18 months, starting on New Year's Day, 1801. That summer, dozens of soldiers died from dysentery and malaria. Among the dead was the highest-ranking officer, a colonel and Revolutionary War veteran, David Strong. Major Jonathan Williams took command and issued orders to keep the camp clean in a futile attempt to prevent the epidemic. Every Sunday, the soldiers would sweep out the filth and trash. Williams also ordered the privies relocated away from the living quarters to the edge of the camp. These orders explain why Wagner and his team are finding, for now, only the smallest of fragments.
But the post is being cleaned and they're hauling the bigger things off somewhere and disposing of them. And so you get the little things that when they're sweeping around the buildings that they don't find. And we're finding those.
Wagner decides to move the investigation farther downhill to a place on the site where he earlier found a cluster of broken brick.
More sizable than anything we've found in the unit so far.
The unit yields more brick and fragments of glass and ceramic.
Early 19th century site out here again.
After the removal of nearly a foot of soil, Wagner's trowel scrapes a rusted object embedded within a cluster of brick. He's about to discover one of the most important artifacts of the excavation.
It's a bayonet socket.
It's a late 18th, early 19th century bayonet socket.
And this is the part that would fit onto the end of the barrel, and here is the blade.
It proves there are features beneath the surface, and those features hold artifacts.
This is the first definite military feature that we can really associate with the cantonment that we found out here. So now we know that what we're getting at here is that the cantonment just isn't the scatter of artifacts here and that it's all been plowed up, but there's actually intact things, parts of buildings that are now here underneath the ground, underneath the plow zone, and we're not going to really know what this thing is until we've got it all cleaned off.
The bayonet socket found at the cantonment is a significant artifact. We met with Mark Wagner at his laboratory on the SIU Carbondale campus to talk about the object and to understand its importance in the overall investigation of Cantonment Wilkinsonville.
These things were quite commonly lost on military bases, and it got so bad the soldiers would use them for different things than they were intended to do. They'd take them and they'd stick them in the ground like this and put candles in them, or they might use them as digging tools or whatever. And it got so bad that at one point the Army, when they commissioned some new guns to be made, they ordered that the bayonets be welded onto the guns. So the soldiers always had to carry them around with the bayonets on them.
If you've ever thought of archaeology as one of those glamour jobs, take a good look. Not only is this team of archaeologists fighting the tall grass and weeds, but they're hoping to stay away from the ticks, lots of them, crawling, biting, and attaching themselves to everyone. Led by archaeologist Mark Wagner, the crew is establishing a grid, the framework of crisscross parallel lines needed to keep track of the site. Without it, you would never know how one spot in the field relates to another, or know exactly where you're digging. Context is everything in archaeology. Knowing how the objects found in the ground relate to one another is critical in understanding how they got there. Location and context of the artifacts and features found in the ground is very important to the study of the 19th century military base. It's believed 2 maps of the site exist, but they've never been found. That's why it's important for Wagner to pinpoint the location of every artifact and feature to recreate those maps. This phase of the project is funded through the Illinois Historic Preservation Agency. The funds provide the money needed to not only expand the grid where the bayonet socket was found, but also to dig in other spots. Over the next several days, they'll find evidence to confirm one story in the historical record, the tornado of March 14, 1801, a storm that claimed several lives and injured many more. Cantonment Wilkinsonville existed for only 18 months, a frontier military camp built to counter the threat of war with France. The American military built the camp even though the crisis eased and its need was in doubt.
Well, Wilkinsonville came out of a crisis between the U.S. and France in the late 1790s. It looked like we were going to go to war with France. There was a lot of, it started out on the high seas. The French were stopping our ships and they were seizing American ships. And the whole thing escalated. There was a crisis that was called the XYZ affair, where the United States government sent some diplomats to France to try and resolve the crisis. And the French government, officials in the French government, demanded bribes to themselves before they would even negotiate. And when this information from this got back to the United States, it just exploded and war fever developed, and the Congress authorized the expansion of the Army. And as part of that, they recalled George Washington to be commander of the Army, and they made Alexander Hamilton his second in command. And they drew up plans for a reserve base to be established in the lower Ohio Valley in the event of war with France. And the idea would be that the soldiers from this base, if the war did come out, they could move into the lower Mississippi Valley and they could capture New Orleans and they could capture the entire Mississippi Valley for the United States. And so Wilkinson had its inception in that base, the plans for that base. And the interesting thing about it is that the crisis is resolved by late 1799, but the plans for this base go forward for some reason. And what I think is going on is that there is, the president at that time, who was John Adams, has just negotiated a peace treaty with France. And what I think is going on is that there are people in the government, and including the general of the Army, James Wilkinson, who are still going forward with these plans without the knowledge of the president. And they're moving troops and soldiers down the Ohio River Valley. And the reason they're doing this is that the election of 1800 is coming up. And it's widely anticipated that Adams will not be reelected. And there is strong belief that a pro-war candidate will be reelected. So if they can get these soldiers down into the Ohio Valley and get this base established without the knowledge of the president, then if a new pro-war candidate is elected, they'll have the soldiers in place, and if the crisis heats up again with France, they'll all be ready to go. Well, no one knew that the Louisiana Purchase was coming in 3 years. And for the settlers in the Ohio and Mississippi River valleys, the outlet for all their produce, everything that's being produced, all the tobacco and corn and everything, the only market is down in New Orleans. And the United States can't permit that. If it's ever going to expand, it can't permit that port to be under foreign control. So there's a huge sentiment in the western U.S. for taking, somehow, just getting control of New Orleans. And it is true. At that time, the Missouri side of the river, only a few miles away, is Spain. and you go about 20 miles downriver on the Mississippi, you're in Spanish territory. So Wilkinsonville is at the very edge of the United States.
Describe for me the difference between a cantonment and a fort.
Yeah. Well, a cantonment essentially is a camp. The difference is that a fort has got stockade walls. It's like Fort Massac. And you can garrison a fort with a small number of troops, and it's intended as a permanent installation, and it's got towers, bastions and all of this. Whereas a camp, like Cantonment Wilkinson, is intended to hold a large number of men for a short period of time. And it's not fortified, usually, because the soldiers themselves are the defense. You've got so many soldiers down there that nobody is going to attack the place. So they aren't worried about being overwhelmed or something like that. And part of the difference is that they're laid out in different ways too, and I can draw you a map of that. A cantonment, essentially, military camps were laid out in a certain way, and typically they're just a row of tents or cabins like this that are systematically laid out across the landscape. And each tent or camp is occupied by a squad of soldiers. And then you get behind the enlisted men's tents, and you have those of their sergeants are back here. And then behind those, you'll get the ones of the officers, like that. And then in the very back, you'll get the colonel of the regiment is back there in the very back. And in front of the whole camp, or where the men are camped, you'll have a parade ground where they have to form several times a day. They have to form in the morning, they have to form at lunch, and then they have to form at the end of the day. And this is for several reasons. One is that by having the men on parade several times a day, you know that they're still there, and that men are not slipping off. And desertion was a big problem with the frontier army. But you can see that this is a much different sort of layout than you would have at somewhere like Fort Massac. And because military camps are always laid out the same way, there might be some variation in there. But this sort of formation is intended to be that if there's some sort of a surprise attack or anything like that, the enlisted men are out here by company, and they can form rapidly on the parade ground. They know where their sergeants are. The sergeants know where the officers are. And the officers know where the colonel is. So everybody, in the event of emergency, can rapidly form up. So there's not going to be a lot of variation in this, because they don't want to have confusion in the case of an emergency.
The site that you're excavating right now, Mark, does this fit this scenario in terms of layout?
It probably does. It almost certainly does. The problem is that there are no maps of the cantonment that are known to exist. 2 were prepared at the time, and those are both still missing, and we can't locate them. They haven't been seen probably since 1801. And so part of the problem is we're not certain what part of the cantonment we're in. Mm-hmm. We could be we think we're in this part of the cantonment where we're dealing with this area like this, where we have the enlisted men's huts and that, but we're not quite certain. For all we know, they had other buildings at that cantonment. They had a hospital, they had a quartermaster's camp where you would have had storage buildings and larger buildings. And for all we know, we think we're in this, but for all we know, we could be in this area down here in another section of the camp. And the only way we're going to figure it out is to investigate the site systematically. And we can tell from the types of artifacts we're getting and the distribution on the ground. For example, if we are systematically pick up everything on the surface, and we are in the area of the site where the huts are, we should pick up clusters of artifacts as we go along the surface, showing us where these huts are. And if we don't pick that up, then we may be in a different part of the camp than we think we are.
What were the specific time frame for this cantonment?
It was established, well, they started moving soldiers downriver in late 1800, and it took them several months to get downriver. They moved in a convoy of flatboats down the Ohio. And they arrived on New Year's Day, January 1801. And the soldiers that came down were primarily, initially, were the 2nd Regiment. And at that time, that regiment contained about 800 soldiers. So the first soldiers to arrive were the 2nd Regiment. And they were living in tents. They first started with tents, and then they started immediately constructing huts because they were out there in the winter. And as the summer went on, the spring and summer went on, they were joined by more soldiers. They were joined by several artillery units, and then by midsummer they were joined by parts of the 4th Regiment that came out of Tennessee. So at its peak, Wilkinsonville seems to have contained around 1,300 soldiers. And that doesn't seem like a lot of soldiers to launch an invasion of the Mississippi River Valley with. But the commanding officer, who was General Wilkinson, his surviving letters indicate that he had a great contempt for the Spanish as soldiers. And he was very familiar. He'd been to New Orleans a number of times, and he knew what their forces were. And Wilkinson just didn't consider them to be much of an obstacle. But the other thing was they anticipated that if a war did break out, these soldiers, again at this base, were going to serve as the reserve corps, and that they were going to raise a militia in the western country. So they may raise thousands of volunteers to go down with this army. But these are supposed to be the core of the army, and they're going to be supplemented by more troops.
The cantonment existed from January 1801 until 1802 sometime?
Yeah, about May of 1802.
And then about 1,300 troops were there. Fort Massac was pretty much downsized at this time.
Oh, Fort Massac was abandoned. The soldiers from Fort Massac were drawn into this. Fort Massac had only been garrisoned on a company level, which means that it had less than, it was probably not at full strength. It had less than 80 soldiers at it. And so those soldiers and a number of other posts were abandoned at the same time, and they were all brought into this post. And Massac was not reoccupied until Cantonment Wilkinson was abandoned in mid-1802, and then they moved a company of soldiers back over there to Massac.
The tall grass and weeds are gone. Archaeologists are now digging at the site where Mark Wagner found the bayonet socket. The site reveals a large pit full of broken brick with evidence of an intense fire.
We don't know what its original purpose would be, but at some point they came in and they started throwing trash in it and they started having fires in it. And that's something that we also know was going on out here there is one of the order books survives from out here.
The site offers a snapshot of life on the frontier during the earliest years of the 19th century. A little-known period in American military history when compared to the Revolution or the War of 1812.
Well, there we go.
The artifacts tell a story not available through the archive, including details about daily life, like what the soldiers ate and the equipment they used.
It's got like 2 prongs on the end.
The other important fact about Wilkinsonville, no one else lived on the site after the camp closed. The soil holds only the artifacts from one 18-month period 200 years ago.
Yeah, take it down a little bit if it's not. Yeah.
Mike Hargrave is an Army Corps of Engineer archaeologist. He's holding what's called a fluxgate gradiometer. It literally sees underground.
Well, this can basically make a map of underground archaeological features at a historic site. They can be things like cellars that they found here, or privies, cooking pits, cisterns, and things like that. We can make a map of those, and they can excavate and target them very effectively. So there'll be much less wasted effort.
The survey will cover 2 large areas of the early 19th century campsite. A computer will analyze the data and create a map to help pinpoint the most promising places to dig.
Isn't that desirable because you couldn't have a
Thousands of bricks, clothing, and household artifacts, including broken, hand-painted ceramics, a pocket knife, and a collection of military buttons came out of these units. All of it trash, tossed into a cellar and burned 200 years ago. Archaeologist Mark Wagner believes the trash was thrown into the pit and burned after a tornado swept through the camp, killing and injuring 30 people. The pit also confirmed artifacts and features remain in the ground below the topmost layer of soil known as the plow zone. The question now is whether other pits exist on the site, a question the magnetometers will hopefully be able to answer. Those who've studied Wilkinsonville say it existed as a standby army, ready to conquer the Mississippi River Valley. Others say the general of the army, James Wilkinson, and Aaron Burr wanted to use the troops to take control of the lands west of the river and establish their own empire. Whatever the purpose behind Wilkinsonville, nothing came of either plot, at least not right away. The camp closed after only 18 months, and the troops returned to forts located throughout the United States and the territories, including nearby Fort Massac. A solitary grave marker and a historic plaque serve as the only visual reminders the camp existed. The grave marker belongs to Colonel David Strong, the post commander. No one knows the exact location of his final resting place, Instead, the Daughters of the American Revolution placed the marker here years ago as a tribute to the Revolutionary War veteran.
I know about the New Madrid earthquakes and
Nancy Bush lives on land that was once part of the cantonment. She made the connection a few years ago and soon realized the story of the camp is nothing new.
this is hard to see, but this would be where the burial grounds was up there. I went to a Southern 5 regional planning meeting, you know, and I'm making this announcement. I'm so exciting, and they looked at me like, well, yeah, so, you know, what else is new?
Wilkinsonville has been part of the local oral tradition for generations. One interview dating from 1995 describes a cemetery on the site. The speaker is the late Hoot Parker, who recalls visiting there as a young boy with his grandfather. He says he saw caskets and human remains eroding from the riverbank.
So those caskets were falling out of the graves, washing out into the river.
Yeah,
Is that-
all right, now you haven't saw the road down there, have you?
No, I haven't. I haven't been down there.
So if you're going down towards the trailer, how far is this graveyard we've been back from the river? Where he lives now in the trailer, where was the graveyard? All right, it was way over to the left. Okay. Way over. But on the bluff, on the river bluff? On the bluff, yeah.
No one knows if the cemetery still exists. One theory suggests it might. Another says it was destroyed by a recent construction project. It all depends on the graveyard's original location, and that's unknown. If the Wilkinsonville site contains a cemetery, it would be of national importance because at least one grave belongs to a Revolutionary War veteran, Colonel David Strong. The magnetometer survey is complete and downloaded into the computer. Cantonment Wilkinsonville is beginning to reveal itself to the 21st century. The survey finds a number of underground features, including a large object a short distance to the west.
Yeah, if you can give me a coordinate, I'll run the metal detectors.
A probe confirms the feature contains brick.
This is a button.
After a few inches of topsoil are removed, a button is found.
Computer, it's one of those unmarked ones
Yeah.
that we have a bunch, not a bunch of, but fairly well common.
Well, they're using a bunch of unmarked civilian.
Every
type
artifact adds one more piece of information to the study of Cantonment Wilkinsonville.
Yeah, it's a brass
And
button,
that's
fits in the
important
back.
because the archival record is
Well,
limited.
part of what is going on here, doing the archival research on this is very difficult. And part of the reason for that is that if I'm correct that this base was being established without the permission of the president, without his knowledge, there is a great interest in keeping things silent about it. And it is very interesting when you read different officers who were stationed at this base and they leave accounts of their experience on the frontier. Most of them are very careful never to mention, including Wilkinson, who was down there, that they were ever at this place or that this place ever existed. And so you're getting, at the time there was an interest in keeping it silent by the people who were there. Records do exist, but the records from the Army during this period are badly scattered. We did find records that were, the company order book to this, which are the orders that were issued every day. The second commanding officer out there was Major Jonathan Williams, who later went on to become the commanding officer at West Point. And his papers still survive at Indiana University, including his order book for Cantonment Wilkinson and also letters of his relating to Cantonment Wilkinson. So that was about the greatest body of original new archival data that we discovered that other previous historians had not looked at. There also are records relating to this in the National Archives. There was a Quartermaster General of the Army named Isaac Craig, and his papers survive. And his papers contain a lot of information about soldiers who are passing through Pittsburgh on their way down here. So because the records for this base are so badly scattered, you have to go to a number of different archives to find them. So we've been doing extensive research all across the eastern U.S. And in some cases, it may be an officer who is stationed down here, and then he later on goes on to Cincinnati or Indianapolis, and he dies, and his papers are curated there. And what you find out among the papers are letters and documents relating to his service at Wilkinsonville.
What was it like for the typical American soldier at this camp?
Well, I don't think life was very nice for the typical American soldier at this camp. they were kept under pretty severe discipline, especially when the second commanding officer, Major Jonathan Williams, took charge. Soldiers that were moving down the river, they had problems with the soldiers deserting before they ever got down there. Major Williams brought some reinforcements with him, and a number of them managed to get off the boat at Louisville and desert. A lot of these soldiers who had enlisted in the Army at this time, they had enlisted in places like Pittsburgh, in New England, and they hadn't really expected to be taken to the edge of the frontier. So you have a lot of guys in the Army who are not expecting to be all the way down here for an indefinite period of time, and they're trying to get out of the Army. And so at Cantonment Wilkinson, the base is patrolled like any military camp. It's patrolled 24 hours a day by sentries. The soldiers are not allowed to leave the camp, the enlisted men. Their day is taken up with all sorts of construction of the camp, cleaning the camp, parades, inspections, things like that, to essentially keep them busy while they're there. Also, a fact of life that was there were punishments. In Major Williams' order book, which does survive again, he court-martialed during the time he was there. A number of enlisted men were brought up on court-martials. And this was a real common thing. When you've got this many guys out here, people are doing things like getting drunk, getting into fights, things like that. And they're brought up before a court-martial of officers, and their case is heard, and then a punishment is decided. And in some cases, it's just a reduction in rank. But if it's severe enough, the soldiers would be sentenced to be physical punishment, like being flogged. And they're taken out to the parade ground and tied to a post, and they're flogged with a whip, maybe up to I think one of Williams' orders is as severe as 50 lashes for a soldier. And other soldiers were sentenced to ride something that they called the wooden horse, which was essentially it was like just a sawhorse, wooden sawhorse, and the soldier had to sit on it, and they would tie a cannonball to each of his legs, and they'd make him sit there for 10 or 15 minutes. And so the pain must have been excruciating because the punishments go no longer than 15 minutes. But these sort of things are going on down there.
They also, at this particular base, got sick, and that all came out of the order book, I suspect. You learned of the various plights that these people had to survive and endure.
Well, we know from not just the order book, but there are other records that survive. Some of Wilkinson's letters survive. Other documents written to the War Department survive, talk about the sickness. Well, they had a couple things happen. One is a tornado hit the post in March of 1801 and destroyed a number of the buildings and killed a number of the soldiers, and it killed women that were at the post, there were women there that were laundresses, and one of the laundresses was killed. Each company would have had 4 women as laundresses to do their laundry. But the sickness started to hit the post in mid-summer of 1801. And it appears, and this happened all the time when you got this many soldiers together. And if you could not keep the post clean, and if you couldn't keep their water supply clean, people started getting sick. And it's very difficult to determine what they were dying from because the terms for sicknesses in the early 1800s are different than what we use today, but they seem to have been dying from a combination of malaria and dysentery. And we think, although the number is not quite precise because the records are so poor, but as many as 70 of the soldiers may have died before they abandoned the post in mid-1801. They abandoned it in August of 1801 and moved the soldiers to other bases temporarily, and then they brought them back in the fall when the summer was over.
How many people were killed when the tornado went through?
The tornado, I think there were probably only about, there were about 15 people that were injured in that. A sergeant was killed, a woman was killed, and I think those were the only 2 immediate deaths. But then there was a captain, one of the company commanders named Captain Jesse Lukens, and he was severely hurt in the tornado, and then he died subsequently, a few weeks later, of his wounds. So you had 3 people that were killed directly as a result of the tornado, and a number of other people were injured by the tornado may have been by collapsing buildings or just, being thrown around.
A few days ago, this pit was a dark spot on a computer screen, an anomaly, found when archaeologist Mike Hargrave scanned the site with his Fluxgate gradiometer.
And those look like promising features to me. I don't see much more that really turns around. This thing still looks good.
Still, it's really
This
sticking
thing-
out.
this thing-
There's only really two things that it can be. It can only be, in terms of what they would have dug out here, the only two things that they would have dug this deep into the ground would have been either a cellar of some type or a privy.
Wagner reads the layers and considers the historical record to reach a theory as to why the soldiers dug the pit in the first place.
This is the bottom of it. And here's a big layer of brick rubble. This is not part of the building. That is all broken brick that's been thrown in here. And it's contained in this gray layer, which is gray clay, which has been brought up from somewhere else, some other project they're doing on the cantonment, and it looks like they're intentionally filling in this thing. And then when you get above it, you can see some little darker lenses in there. And these have a little bits of brick, and they have a few artifacts in them like nails and glass. The earlier privies had to be out in the fields somewhere. And this kind of fits that pattern, where this is something that has been, it was dug during probably early in the post's occupation. It was intentionally filled in, and then the soldiers are still here. They're still throwing. So we know that this thing was dug and abandoned during the time the post was in operation. It's intentionally closed up for some reason. And it fits with the order that the major gave to construct new privies on the edge of the ravines, which means he didn't want them out in the camp area. He wanted them put away to one side. And that may be, yeah, I would call it like a combination of, I would say for B that it is mainly natural fill. But
The features found sit along an east-west axis and conform to the theory Wagner holds as to how the camp was laid out. There's also animal bone, adding another piece of evidence into camp life and offering insight into the soldiers' life on the frontier.
Enlisted men will have, because they're fed in companies or squads, their cooks, they eat a lot of stews and soups, and so they have a lot of cheap stew cuts. Whereas the officers will be eating things on plates because they're eating a lot of steaks and things like that. So there's a social difference in what you eat also. Big vertebrae cut, and it looks like it's been cut in half.
Cantonment Wilkinsonville was established on this field on New Year's Day, 1801. The purpose behind the camp and the collection of more than 1,000 troops was to counter the threat of war with France, or maybe there's another reason having more to do with the greed of the powerful. One theory suggests the general of the army and the future vice president wanted to use the army to build their own empire somewhere in the West. Whatever its purpose, the camp closed after 18 months and left behind a snapshot of early American military history on the frontier.
It's a heavily corroded pewter uniform button from the late 1790s, early 1800s, and what it's got on it, you can see it's starting to come out. There is a series of stars going around the edges.
Cantonment Wilkinsonville is known locally through a tradition of oral history. The archival record about the camp does exist, but it's scattered and sparse. Not much has ever been written or studied about it aside from a handful of academic articles written decades ago. The artifacts from the Wilkinsonville excavation end up here, at the lab for the Center for Archaeological Investigations on the Southern Illinois University Carbondale campus. Here they're cleaned and sorted, stored, and then cataloged. We visited with Mark Wagner to talk about those artifacts and their importance to our understanding of military life on the early American frontier.
We found probably 10,000 brick fragments alone, and we found thousands of nails and things like that that would have formed parts of buildings, a lot of rubble. When we get through that, we found thousands of other types of artifacts, which include animal bones, dishes, plates, bottles, some military equipment. The important thing about the assemblage at Cantonment Wilkinson is that it's only a year, they were only out there a year and a half. So it gives you a really tight time period. I mean, this is the sort of site that archaeologists really like, because at Fort Massac, for example, the French were there first, and then the Americans were there, and then later on settlers came in and lived on top of it. And so what you end up with is you can end up with a mixture of things, and you're never quite sure where they deal with or where they come from in time. Cantonment Wilkinson, from what we can determine, it was only there for a year and a half. And after the soldiers abandoned it, nobody ever came back and lived in that area, in this area of the camp at least. So we know that we're getting a look at the U.S. Army in a very tight time period. And the other thing that's interesting about it, or significant about it, is that you don't really know a lot about the Army during that period. We know a lot about the Revolutionary War Army. We know a lot about the Army during the War of 1812. But this is kind of an in-between period where we don't know a lot about what's going on out there. And we do have written records, but they can't give you all the information you need on daily life. They won't, for example, you might read in written records that the soldiers are eating cattle and maybe pork out there. But when you look at the animal bones, you may find something completely different is going on. You know, there may be a lot of wild animals. They may be going down to the river to fish, and so you get other information coming out of the by analyzing the animal bones. The other thing that you don't find any information on in official records are things like this. You can look at any sort of records regarding the Army from this time period, or you can look at books on that like describe life in the American Army, and they show all the equipment and what things like that. Well, the one thing they hardly ever show you are these things, which are the dishes and plates and things of daily life that are being used by the soldiers out there. Well, this was this is a pearlware cup. It's a teacup, and it dates from about it's late 1700s, early 1800s. Cantonment Wilkinson's only occupied for a year and a half, so we know that this thing was thrown away no later than 1802. The thing about this is that during this time period, the enlisted men in the Army would have been using things like wooden bowls, wooden plates, maybe tin cups and things like that. These sort of things, these sort of really nice cups like this, teacups and saucers and plates like this, are not being used by the enlisted men, they're being used by the officers. And what is probably going on out there is that these things are the remains of the regimental mess of the 2nd Regiment, where the officers would go together in a group and they pull their money and they would order a set of dishes. Probably from New England. These things were all made in England originally, but they probably bought them from some company that had imported them in New England probably. And so they would have, the officers would have this set of dishes and cups to use every day. And the reason for this is that entertaining is very important in the Frontier Army. They're doing this partly to separate themselves from the enlisted men, but you've got things like the colonel there, and we have his probate record, which lists the things that he had when he died out there. And it's real clear he's doing a lot of entertaining. And there are 10 company captains in his regiment, and he probably invites the company captains to come eat with him. And they're using these sort of things. And the company captains, in turn, are inviting him to eat with them. And so this sort of social thing is making a bond between the officers. And it also sets them apart from the enlisted men again. The enlisted men have no use for plates like this because they're being fed in companies, and the things that they're typically fed are like stews and soups, things that are eaten in bowls. They aren't being fed things that you eat on a plate, like a steak. And so that's part of what is going on with this sort of assemblage. These are both French and British gunflints. The way you can tell them apart is their color. The French gunflints are honey-colored, and the British ones are grayer. And during this time period, the United States Army imports all its gunflints from Europe. They don't get any made in the United States. And typically, they're using French gunflints like this. And so finding these sort of things, these British ones, is kind of a surprise. And this may relate again to the crisis of the late 1790s. And it may be that for some reason the supply of French gunflints is being cut off, or the U.S. Army is exhausting its French gunflints, and they're having to make do with British gunflints, which are a lesser quality gunflint that people don't like to use as much. So this is kind of new information for the Army during this period. We actually have quite a few British gunflints coming off this site, which is something that I wouldn't have expected to have seen out there.
This actually was imported from France. That
Right.
came in from France. And there is no equivalent of that kind of flint in this country?
No,
Is that?
no. If you look at, people have done studies of Revolutionary War sites where they know the only troops that were engaged were American troops and British troops. And the predominant gunflint to come off those sites are French gunflints, because the British military did the same thing. During times of peace with France, they imported millions of French gunflints, and they would warehouse them. And for the same reason, it's just a higher quality flint that produces a better spark than the British gunflint.
Interesting.
This is a piece of grape shot where you would have put these in a cannon, This is an anti-personnel shell of the time, similar to a shotgun, where you would have had a number of these in a charge inside a cannon, and you fire it out, and these things spread out after the cannon is fired. And this confirms to us that at least part of the site we're working in, we may be in the area where the artillery units are, to have recovered this piece of grape shot that apparently somebody dropped and did not find and ended up being discarded. Let's see. This came off a field near where we were working. A private landowner found this and showed it to us. This is, again, one of the few artillery items we got off the site. It's a 4-pound cannonball that never appears to have been fired. They did have a number of artillery units down there, and the cannons they were using were 4- and 6-pound cannons. During this, well, you could fire something like this. The range, if you elevate the gun high enough, the range is over a mile long. So they could shoot this thing completely across the Ohio River. If there were soldiers on the other side of the river or someone else, if there are boats on the river that they wanted to stop, they could fire them and hit them. And if you look at the size of this thing, it's about the size of a hardball. And being hit by that would not be a pleasant experience. So we ended up with several different calibers of bullets. But again, these are things this one has never been fired. You can feel it's even got a rough spot on the side from being cast, and you really need to file that off. And so this is a bullet that's actually just been cast and been dropped and never been used. Somebody dropped it and couldn't find it again, and that was the end of it. We did get some uniform parts out there, and these are some of the uniform parts. Again, these are things that you would not get on a civilian site of the time period. These are really neat, and they are very unique. They're the only time I've ever seen these. And what they are is, during this time, soldiers wore leather stocks around their necks, similar to what Marines did. And this is where the Marines are called leathernecks, and that comes from the fact that during the late 1700s, early 1800s, the Marines wore these leather stocks, and you would fasten these brass clasps in the front to hold the stock, to close the stock. And the Army did the same thing they did in the late 1700s, early 1800s. The soldiers also wore these leather stocks, and these were the actual clasps, and both enlisted men and officers wore these leather stocks. And it did two things. One was it gave you a more soldierly appearance. It made you hold your head up straight. And I'm sure they were ungodly hot to wear in Southern Illinois. But the other function behind them is that if you're fighting with someone and they're swinging at your neck with a sword or a saber or something, you have this leather collar around your neck that can block that blow. And so that's part of the reason for that. These are the other items. These are typical buttons for an infantryman of that period. And what they are, you can barely make it out. There's an American eagle in the center, and he has a shield on his chest. And this was the predominant button that we found. And this is the sort of button that would have been worn by an infantryman on his coat, like that. This looks like it's actually a clasp knife or a pocket knife. It's got a little projection here where the blade would have folded back into the handle. So somebody's pocket knife again. In this case, the bone plates are missing on both sides of that. We have a little buckle here that probably is coming off somebody's pack. It might be off of an infantryman's pack. They do have shoe buckles during this time, but most of the time the shoe buckles are made out of brass or pewter. So the fact that this is iron probably means that it's coming off of somebody's pack.
We've been talking about this site and these artifacts, and they're all very valuable and so forth in terms of their educational value to us. But why is it important to excavate this site?
The reason it's important to excavate this site is that it is a unique assemblage. We have no other military sites in Illinois from this time period. A number of the soldiers that were stationed at this post were veterans of the Revolution. So in one sense, this is our best link with the American Revolution. The commanding officer who was out there, Colonel Strong, was a Revolutionary War veteran. We know that some of the enlisted men, even though we're talking about 20 years after the Revolution, were Revolutionary War veterans also. So this site represents a direct link with the Revolution.
Well, then the next stage for you hopefully is to continue excavating, but there's also this concern that in your mind that this site could be theoretically, I guess, dug up and damaged and destroyed and so forth through the development that's going on in the area. Is there anything you can do to protect that or prevent that?
Well, the site itself, the areas we have been working on are located on private property. And one of the best ways to preserve sites is for them to remain in private ownership. Because, private owners are, by and large, are very protective of their property. They don't like people coming on and digging holes in most cases. And so if it remained in private ownership, that would be the best possible situation. And I don't think the state has any interest in trying to acquire this without the landowner's consent. What I'd like to see at some point is that if the landowners were willing to sell, and if the state of Illinois could come up with the money, that the state could purchase the property or purchase parts of it, and you could have another historic site similar to Fort Massac, where you could actually have something that could add to the area through tourism, where you could have buildings reconstructed, and people could come down, reenactors similar to what you have at the Chart and Massac. And you could also have a museum that could incorporate some of these items. So the items that we've got here, plus a number of other items, could go on display there permanently and be in that area, and it would benefit the people in that area.
60, 88,
Okay.
70, 98.
Only a few years ago, the story of Cantonment Wilkinsonville was nothing more than a historical footnote, a small part of a very big story of the American frontier and western expansion. Now there's a better idea of what happened at this spot 2 centuries ago. A stronger connection exists between frontier Illinois and early American history.